Hey, it's me again. Just wanted to take a few minutes and explain to you exactly what the condition is that I have. Just to give you a little bit of background, I am diabetic. I was diagnosed about 16 years ago, and so I had the diabetes and it wasn't really under control. And then I noticed about 2 years ago my eyesight, which had been fine. I'd never wore glasses my entire life. It had been fine, and then I started noticing that it was getting blurry, and I was having a hard time seeing the computer and the TV and things like that, and just general fatigue, sluggishness, I should say. There was just something wrong, and then my eyes just got worse and worse, and decided to come back to Ohio. We were living out of state in Alaska. We decided to come back because I felt I needed to be close to my mom and my sister, who lived here, so I could have some support for my medical condition. After I got here, it just kind of deteriorated. I started getting dizzy spells. I started having a hard time walking without feeling faint or getting out of breath, sweating. I started getting sick. I would have these bouts where I would be literally vomiting for like 16, 17, 18 hours straight. I ended up in the hospital, I believe it was 5 times before I even had my stroke, between January of 2018 and January of 2019. And it got to the point where I could only stand up for a couple minutes and then I had to sit down or I was going to faint. I have fainted before or almost fainted, or I would get sick and start vomiting. So anyway, I'm leaving a lot of stuff out, but after all of this, I ended up having a really, really bad spell where I thought I was going to pass out, a really bad dizzy spell, and I had been vomiting for hours. And I had been at the hospital on a Saturday night. My sister had taken me and they gave me fluids and they sent me home. The next Wednesday, so just a few days later, I had another flare up again and it was even worse. So my sister took me back to the hospital. That was on January 16th, 2019. And then they did an MRI, among other tests, on January 18th, and that's when they found the stroke. So it turns out I had had a stroke sometime within 1 to 2 months, they said, but they couldn't be sure. But I'd also had the symptoms of the passing out and the getting sick and all of that for months before I even had the stroke. I had already been researching dysautonomic disorders and things like that because I thought something was wrong. Then after the stroke, I was in the hospital for a week. Then they transferred me to Edwin Shaw Medical Rehabilitation Center. I was there for 2.5 weeks. And then they released me home in February of 2019. However, I had to deal with the effects afterwards from the stroke, which thankfully I was lucky, surprise, surprise, but where it affected me, it was on the cerebellum, and it didn't affect my speech or my cognitive ability, and it didn't drastically favor one side or the other. I didn't get paralysis in either side. I do have a lot of soreness in my left arm and weakness in my left arm and leg, but I'm not paralyzed. So things could have been worse when it comes to the stroke. However, even after some of the symptoms from the stroke subsided and I was feeling better for that, I still had all of the dysautonomic symptoms. So I was going to my regular doctor. I was going to they sent me to a neurologist. They sent me to a hematologist. They sent me to a kidney doctor, too. That has nothing to do with these particular symptoms because my protein was high in my urine. And they finally did what's called a tilt table test. I had that in May, and that came back markedly abnormal, is what it said, among other things. But it turns out I have something that is called pan-dysautonomia. Those of you who have some type of autoimmune disorder like this might be familiar with that, or anything on the spectrum of dysautonomia. I know one of the more common things is POTS, which is the postural orthostasis tachycardia syndrome. So mine is similar to that. Basically, what happens is my blood pressure is not regulated. I had already been on medication for high blood pressure, but it's not regulating itself automatically like it should when I go from laying to sitting to standing. So basically what it does is it's too high when I'm laying, which it shouldn't be, but then when I stand up, it goes too low or lower, but at the same time my heart rate goes too high. And it's almost like a tornado in my blood system, and it causes me to pass out. I can only stand up for about, when I left rehab, I was only at 45 seconds. And when I tested myself a few weeks ago, I was at 1 minute and 39 seconds that I could stand up before I had to sit back down, or felt like I was going to pass out. So it's still, obviously, it's very debilitating because I can barely do anything that involves, having to stand up. So I have two walkers. I have one that's a rollator with the seat, and one that is just a regular, it's got wheels on it, but it doesn't have a seat. When I go someplace that I know there'll be a wheelchair there for me, then I take the one without the seat, and I can walk from the car to the wheelchair. When I go someplace where there's not going to be a wheelchair, then I take the rollator. So if I have to sit down suddenly because I can't stand, there's the little seat that's on the rollator that I can sit down. But I have to plan my life around basically where there's going to be a place to sit or me to lay down. I can't go out. I haven't been to a store, like a grocery store or Walmart or anything like that, since before January 16th. And we're now in August, so if you can imagine how long that is. I've been to one friend's house and my aunt's house for a few hours each time. And again, I had to take my walker, and I had to, those days I went, they had to be good days for me because I have good and bad days. I have days where I feel worse than others, days that it's harder for me to get up and get around, and other days that, it's not. So still, a couple times out, and then the only other time I go out is to go to my doctor's appointment.